Welcome to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. In this special 5-part series, we take a look at the book recently released by General Stanley McChrystal, Jeff Eggers, and Jason Mangone, entitled Leaders, Myths, and Reality. But first, a word from our sponsor. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? With the expansion of the Compliance Podcast Network, I am looking for a new podcast. If you've wondered how to get going on a podcast, a word from our sponsor, One Stone Creative.
If you are enjoying this show, you might enjoy hosting your own. As an expert in your field, you have skills, knowledge, and insight that can help you expand your practice, meet new people, and create amazing content to share with the world. In as little as 2 hours a week, you can dramatically change how you promote, fill, and position your business. And One Stone Creative can show you how. Learn more at onestonecreative.net.
In this special podcast series, Richard Lummis and I take a look at leadership styles from General McChrystal's book. They include the founders, Walt Disney and Coco Chanel, the geniuses, Albert Einstein and Leonard Bernstein, the heroes, Zheng and Harriet Tubman, the power brokers, Boss Tweed and Margaret Thatcher, and the reformers, Martin Luther and Martin Luther King Jr. Episode 4, The Power Brokers, Boss Tweed and Margaret Thatcher. 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, podcast about leadership. This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. We believe leadership is a skill which can be improved with study of both good and bad practices, and we try to draw interesting examples from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we're continuing our discussion of Stanley McChrystal's book, Leaders, Myth, and Reality, and we're going to talk about the chapter that he titles The Power Brokers. This is particularly interesting because the two people he picked are so, diametrically opposed in at least the public mind, with Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in the second half of the 19th century New York City, and then Margaret Thatcher, the great British Prime Minister of the 80s. In getting into this chapter, McChrystal first starts discussing the nature of power, which I thought was an interesting way to do it. He defines it several different ways, whether it's the ability to influence a group or the ability to get something done. But then he also says that in his experience, it derives more from reputation than rank, more from persuasion than direction, and more from example than prescription. And I think these two people kind of exemplified that.
They certainly did, Richard, and the point that I picked up from the paragraphs you were reading was that a power broker wields influence and symbols like a tangible good. And he used the example of a barrel of oil, which, frankly, I never thought of symbols as being a tangible good. The example, the most stark example, and I would certainly have agreed with it, was after the bombing in the hotel in England, where the Conservative Party was going to give its had its annual conference, bombing by the IRA that was aimed directly at Thatcher. Within 6 hours, she was walking through the front door of that hotel, and that was a incredibly powerful symbol. But he really talked about power in a way I had not thought of, because he talked about power as an arrangement among multiple stakeholders, and that to obtain power with multiple stakeholders, you have to give those stakeholders something they wanted. And what Tweed and Thatcher gave them was an intangible good that I would not have thought of as something you can give someone, yet it made perfect sense, which was identity. And with Tweed, it was the social identity of the Irish, largely members of Tammany Hall in London, in New York City. And in Thatcher, it was the resurrected feeling of pride and patriotism in the United Kingdom, which I've had an occasion to sort of study English and Great Britain's history, or political history, over the past 50 years. And certainly by the mid-'70s, the English nation was really at a nadir. in how it viewed itself, how I think it viewed, how the world viewed it, and maybe even how the world viewed it. It was a little bit earlier, but one of my favorite lines from a James Bond movie was called Thunderball, was when Bond is negotiating over the sale or return of nuclear weapons that were stolen. The Spectre character says, "Well, Mr. Bond, your pitiful little island hasn't even been threatened."
Yeah.
And I think post-war England, leading to the '60s in England, led to a '70s that economically were just devastating to England. And Margaret Thatcher turned that around with the symbol of return to English greatness, or at least having pride among yourself. And so both of those strategies worked with stakeholders, which in turn those stakeholders gave them power, and they gave Thatcher the power through the ballot box. I suppose Tweed, we have to concede that he got power through the ballot box, but he delivered. He delivered in a way that political clubs did in the 19th century and early 20th century. They delivered jobs, they delivered turkeys on Thanksgiving, they delivered help to widows who needed assistance if a husband died. They would help a husband if a wife was sick or ailing, so that there was a delivery of services back from the political leader. And then they both worked to consolidate the groups they were working with and share power with them, so that their groups, constituent groups, felt that they were invested in the leader. Now, this was not the individuals voting, although that was some of it. It was primarily the top echelon of leadership, which put the two in power. So Tweed had a lunch club with three of his cronies, where they basically shared the spoils of fraud and embezzlement from New York City. Thatcher had a breakfast group of the leaders of the Conservative Party that helped to get her into power. This was not the old leaders from the 60s and 70s. This was a new group, and that group kept her in power right up to the end. And when she engaged in that behavior that alienated them, that's when she lost power. And he ended his chapter with, the true leadership of power brokers is to manage the followers in institutions, which then turn around and enable the leaders. And I thought, I would have thought this may have been the most difficult chapter to really put in a business leadership context, but the way he ended it, I thought, was the most thought-provoking, at least in terms of a way I could see this concept working in the business world, because truly it's almost servant leadership. And I think we've heard that term in the business world a little bit more than the political world, but that type of leadership, I think, is recognized, at least today, as one that can work and one of value for a company.
Yeah, and to me, the most striking part of this chapter was the mutuality of the relationship. You tend to think of the power flow really only going one way, but it doesn't at all.
Exactly, and that's the thing that struck me, that there were goods going down, but there were goods going up, and there were ideas going up that were incorporated into the power brokers' sort of intellectual repertoire, I should say, that they would execute upon. And when the group below them, who was enabling them, saw that, they viewed that as a reflection of them, and they gave the power broker even greater power.
Yeah. Well, while we certainly wouldn't encourage you to emulate Boss Tweed in all of his aspects, I highly recommend this chapter in terms of more thought-provoking insights from McChrystal.
And also is, frankly, one of the clearest discussions of how they stole the money that I have seen. So if you're interested in some local political lessons, it's very good at that.
Yeah. Well, once again, this is Richard Lummis and Tom Fox signing off for 12 O'Clock High.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. I hope you'll join Richard Lummis and myself again, where we take a look at another set of leaders from the recent book by General Stanley McChrystal and his co-authors, and take a consideration of how they can help you in your leadership
for business going forward. Kovaklakai, a podcast on business leadership, is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.